Welcome, and thank you for joining us. Today we're going to have a chat about planning, budgeting, financial reporting at government contractors. And to help us in that conversation, we have Colt from Baker Tilly. Want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Keith. Yeah, I'm Colt Murrah. I'm on the Baker Tilly digital team. Baker Tilly is the 9th largest accounting and advisory firm in the U.S. with $5.2 billion in worldwide revenue. I specifically work on the GovCon Technologies team within Baker Tilly Digital. And the GovCon Technologies team really focuses on delivering digital solutions to government contractors, ranging from ERPs to performance management, business intelligence, robotic process automation, just to name a few.
Thank you, Colt. And we have John from Archetype.
Thank you, Keith. Yeah, I'm John Moorhead. I'm the head of our OneStream Center of Excellence here at Archetype. Archetype is a consultancy focused not on building systems or creating data, but collecting data, protecting it, curating it, and weaponizing it for competitive advantage. We've been a OneStream partner for over 5 years now, are a Diamond partner, and have over 200 live projects.
So how is government contract similar to any other commercial business in this space?
Yeah, so government contracting really is a sector. And it crosses all the different industries out there because it just means that the U.S. federal government is one of your primary customers, right? And the federal government buys pretty much everything. And when it comes to budgeting as a government contractor, just like every organization, you could have a lot of different budget methods you follow, whether that's top-down, bottoms-up, zero-based, traditional incremental, driver-based budgeting, right? And so just like every other organization out there, they still have to get all their budget inputs, compile them in one solution to build up to their annual operating plan or a forecast scenario.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we've seen when we're working with government contractors is that there are a lot of similarities, to your point, just a few added complexities on top of that that are really important to hit. And that's one of the things that I think we've had some interesting conversations about between you and I, and some of the interesting solutions we're going to talk about today.
Yeah.
So what are some of those complexities?
Yeah, so first and foremost, as a government contractor, you may need to conform with certain compliance regulations and cost accounting standards. Most specifically, you have to be able to record and track different types of costs, different types of indirect costs and direct costs, and then ultimately allocate those indirect costs to the benefit and cost objectives. And so, on top of all that, you have these ERP systems that are really good at doing that in a compliant manner on actuals, right? But having a solution that can also do that on your plan data and handle all the different types of budget methods required as a government contractor is really the challenge a lot of government contractors face in their planning process. And at 50,000 feet, right, you have to go through their process to create their annual budget or their annual operating plan. That annual operating plan ultimately informs the cost pools that create their forward pricing rates that they submit to the government, right? Once they have those forward pricing rates, that actually changes and impacts the burdens for price estimating and for project budgeting, right? And then that comes full cycle because when you change your burdens and your buildup of cost and revenue and project budgeting, that ultimately ends up impacting your annual operating plan and your forecast for that current year.
Yeah. And wouldn't you say, too, that one of the challenges around that that many of the government contractors face is that those tend to be disconnected processes that kind of move slowly. They don't like seamlessly flow in that nice cycle that you just outlined because they're often done in disparate systems by different people, and so it can be a little bit difficult to smoothly integrate all those, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Especially when it comes to project budgeting, usually that's in a different solution. And then also, just a lot of government contractors have a hard time finding a solution that can really track, allocate, and monitor their indirect cost pools and rates and structures in a meaningful way.
So why is budgeting so much more important in this space than you've touched on a number of things than for some other commercial venture?
Yeah, I think, project budgeting can be important all over the place. In government contracting specifically, they have to deliver on time and within budget, which means that they're usually continuously updating their estimates to complete and their estimates at complete. Mm-hmm. On top of that, the government uses a lot of different contract vehicles to deliver, to basically buy products, right? And those end up having different buildups of cost and revenue depending on the contract vehicle. So fluctuations in indirect costs and rates ultimately impact those cost buildups and calculations to revenue for those different types of contract vehicles.
Yeah, and again, it's not all that different than what we've seen in typical project budgeting on other commercial ventures that are not government contractors. I think one of the things that we found, though, is there's a great level of detail, even for the less complicated government contractors, of all these differences. Because again, coming back to those different contract vehicles and option years and all these kind of interesting intricacies that happen mostly with government contractors. Again, you can see them with private companies, but I think the ratio of those kinds of contracts are a little bit different. And again, the detail level that they have to go to presents a little bit of a unique challenge, because you don't want to have a system that's overly burdensome to the users and asks for data at too granular level, but you need it at a granular enough level to, again, drive those profitability analyses that you need and make sure you're going to hit on time for each different part of the contract, because oftentimes there's deadlines, for different parts of the contract even compared to the whole thing, whereas that's just not as common in a commercial venture. And then on top of that, the integration, as we spoke to, with the wider process of getting back to your indirect rates, it's related to your indirect rates, which affect your direct projects, which can, the cycle dependency there, again, is something that you just don't see as much in private companies, or I should say companies with only private customers, pardon me.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll say on that is that with project budgeting, like you said, it could be at different levels of detail, but a lot of government contractors, they really need to do that detailed resource level project budgets, especially if they're budgeting on time and materials type contracts where they need the buildup of costs and the burden structure, and also the revenue calculations on the PLCs that those different resources are charging to. And so, I think what is done well in project budgeting in OneStream is that you're able to do that level of detail, even though that level of detail isn't typically something you see being stored in the cubes themselves.
Yeah, because it's a tough level of detail to collect in a way that is also still user friendly and we would usually use the technical term dense enough to make sense in a cube. But again, that's one of the technical advantages that OneStream has, is that we don't have to worry about those what we may have been classical technical constraints around that particular problem. And I think an important thing to point out, and maybe most of the audience is aware of this, but when you have a specific employee on projects, but my understanding is that which employees you use can vastly affect what indirect rates come with them, which then can affect the final burden of that project, correct? So again, it's one of those things where many of our private customers, I keep saying that, many of our customers with private clients only, not public clients, they don't have to worry as much about which employees go on a project, because they don't have to report around it. I mean, it still might have similar effects, I suppose, the total cost of having that project, because they have maybe more expensive or more tenured resources, but it's not something that we ever see our clients worrying too much about, but government contractors really do care about that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, because different employees could carry different fringe benefit burdens. They could carry different overhead burdens depending on how complex the overhead pool structures are for those clients. And then getting back to T&M, right, they could have a lot of different profitability on different labor categories if they're in the same labor category, but you have a cheaper employee with a lower fringe rate and lower overhead costs versus you had originally, assumed that something else was going to occur.
Yeah.
So you've brought up a lot of interesting things that the organization needs to consider and work through. And you briefly mentioned OneStream. So where does OneStream come into play in this?
Well, so going back to the point that Colt made earlier about that interdependent cycle, I talked a little bit about how those tend to be disparate or more disconnected processes. Mm-hmm. I think the real advantage that we see at OneStream is the ability to connect those and unite them all in a single platform. That what I would say would be the biggest single benefit that we've seen. It's capable of doing all the different parts of that process in the same place and with the technology that makes them each shine the most, because each of them is a unique enough challenge that you wouldn't want to use the same exact technological tool, just like you wouldn't want to use a hammer everywhere in a house, right? Occasionally you need screws and you need brace plates, you need all sorts of different tools to make a really great house. OneStream has that platform capability to use the right tool for the right problem, but in the same space where users don't have to switch systems and data doesn't have to shuffle around as much. It's all there together.
Yeah, I completely agree. And just getting back to project budgeting in particular, there's so much detail there, and OneStream can solve relational tables and not have to be structured into just multidimensional architecture. The other thing about it too is, if you have to do all this project budgeting on an ongoing basis, and whether or not you typically do that now in Excel, a project management tool in your ERP, why wouldn't that data just be one of your budget input methods into your AOP or into your forecast, since you're doing all that bottoms-up budgeting work anyways, at least on the direct side? And even if you don't want them to feed directly, you could at least have it in the same solution so that it can inform, and you can do scenario reviews to say, okay, well, here's what the project budgeting buildup is, and here's what's in my AOP or my forecast.
Yeah. Well, that's a process that we actually see a lot with all of our clients, is the idea that, or many of our clients, I should say, is that we want to be able to occasionally do forecast and budget at different levels. It's very common to not want to do, if we're doing a zero base or really detailed bottoms up budget, I don't want to repeat that every single month. But in OneStream, because of extensible dimensionality and some of the other great features that they've packed in, we're able to really tightly align those so that even though maybe we have different ways of the data coming in, we can marry the data at the right level for meaningful analysis, to your point. Or if you do truly want to do bottoms up, we can use that same model, and because of, again, our ability to take that data, seed it forward, it can make it really easy for some clients to just use the same exact thing every month. They just tweak it just a little bit. So it actually makes it possible to do a bottoms-up forecast every month, whereas, again, doing a bottoms-up Excel-based forecast or something could be quite a nightmare, to be honest.
Yeah.
Right? You wouldn't really want to do that, but a system like this it's flexible enough to go either way. Whatever makes sense to the organization and what they need to do is enabled by the technology, which is, you want it to enable something, you don't want it to get in the way. And that's one of the things we love about OneStream.
Right.
So you've mentioned people and planning at this detailed person level that's needed in here. Can you talk a little bit more about what that technical solution might be like in that?
Yeah. So, and it's kind of two different parts, and this is one of the things that OneStream can do. We can do person level budgeting, and just, I think what we talked about, categories like IRAD and BNP, right? And you don't want to get down to an actual indirect project, because you don't care about indirect projects at that level of detail. So I could do a real detailed person level by month costing and get an idea of roughly how those buckets break out. And it makes it pretty easy and quick to just input your people, bring in your people from your HRS to begin with, make a couple of tweaks, and then your calculations are done and easy. And then when it comes to actually directly assigning people to direct projects, that's obviously a little bit more detailed. It's just going to be manually intensive, because you've got to use your human intelligence to figure out where do these people slot into what projects. But that can be done in a different part of the system that maybe does take a little bit longer, but that's okay because we know it is. But this people planning, they're kind of two separate but related systems that inform each other, but are done at different paces and allow for different information to be used, and not have to slow the whole process down, the entire process, just because there's a little bit of manual stuff over here. I don't know, does it kind of...
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I mean, every organization's a little bit different in terms of how they build up to their budget, right? Most organizations do project budgeting, at least on the direct side. You could certainly use project budgeting to budget indirect projects or capital projects. So, project budgeting can be used, but for a lot of organizations that are too big, you maybe want a simpler method. Or even if you're small and you want to simplify your planning process, maybe you want a simpler method, and that might be just using workflows and forms to budget large amounts for the different categories of indirect costs, like overhead, BMP, IR&D, or like we delivered for one client, that people planning solution that custom tailored so that they could then, at a minimum, take their employees, put percentages to those different categories, and have that feed into the cube, right? So it's really the flexibility about getting the budget inputs in the way you want into the system.
Yeah.
Well, flexibility is always good. Makes it easier to have this across multiple clients. And I've heard mentioned direct and indirect people planning, and this is all in the same platform, all for the same solution for a given client. What do you think, from a user perspective, excites them the most about that? What have you seen there?
You want to take this one, or you want me to?
Yeah, so Well, I definitely could talk to it. User experience in OneStream is something that I'm very passionate about. So if you see me in any of my other presentations, it's something I talk about quite a bit. But I'll say that I think OneStream has a very intuitive user interface to begin with. It has just a lot of out-of-the-box functionality that makes it very easy to understand, putting in data over time in buckets that make sense. It allows you to have a forecast scenario that switches to a quarterly or yearly view by year. So if you want to do months for 1 year and then just a couple of years on the out years without having to go to the monthly level, it just lets you do that, which I think is, again, very intuitive to users. On top of that, we also get the flexibility to tailor these user experiences to be exactly what a particular client needs. One of my favorite personal success stories was a research firm we had where they had scientists inputting the budgets, and scientists don't really care about money as long as they get to do their research. They don't really want to worry too much about it, but they actually put their budgets in and said they actually kind of enjoyed it that year. No negative words were said. They're just vaguely positive words, which to me was a huge thing, because you just don't see those kinds of end users obviously speaking in anything but negative terms about having to do something they don't want. So I find that being able to craft that user experience is really great. And so we've been able to apply that here. Again, project budgeting is one of those things that, because of the level of detail, it can be a little bit onerous if you don't do it right. And if you add on top a user experience that's clunky and annoying, it takes an already difficult process and makes it harder, and that's just not what you want. So the ability to use all the different tools that OneStream puts at our disposal to create just the kind of user experience that we need is something that, again, personally I'm passionate about, that I think Archetype is very passionate about, and I think we've been able to utilize that passion in our government contracting clients to allow for the ease of that particular process that is so necessary.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. To summarize, I would say the fact that you can customize the workflows and the screens to make the interface intuitive to end users is really what sets it apart and makes it such a great tool. And back to project budgeting, you just think about it from from just a user goes in, they get to select a project, they have a screen specific for labor hours, they plan out resources by hour, they have a screen specific for non-labor costs, they plan those resources out, or those amounts out. And it's just like, a few clicks of the button, drop down lists. It's just very easy to follow if you're, been doing project budgeting in Excel or any other solution. And so the fact that you can customize and build that in the application is impressive.
Well, and then I think taking that and then moving it through to the burdening, being able to calculate burdens from there, and then taking all of that and getting that indirect rate planning. Again, that was one of the things that we really saw as a competitive advantage, if you will, of this particularly unified solution. So I think it's an important thing to point out that the user interface of project budgeting is different than you would expect for the user interface of like the indirect rate calculations, because it's two totally different sets of people that are doing it. So again, we can use this common system and tailor those experiences a little bit differently. And so for the indirect rate calculations, for example, we're pulling definitions from the ERP in order to simplify life for those administrators. There's usually only a couple of people that are given, even in relatively large clients. I think we found that only a few people really handle the indirect rate calculations for budgeting, right? So you're already looking at a smaller, more informed user base who's more aware of the process that's going on from end to end, right? Whereas project budgeting might just be a couple of PMs, and they're not really responsible for the upstream or the downstream. They just need to do their little bit. And so that's a different problem to solve than the indirect rate allocation. And so we can present a little bit more information there. It already is kind of a larger set of information pulling down these cost pool definitions and base definitions, but they're aware of it. And so we can create a user interface that's a little bit more robust there with a little bit more data presented to walk through that particular problem. So that's just, I think, one of the benefits of using the system is the ability to have that flexibility to tackle two different problems in two different ways.
Yeah. And then that allocation engine build specifically, and we haven't even talked a lot into detail about that yet, but the end users go in, and it probably looks and feels somewhat similar to what they're used to seeing in their ERP system, because we are able to take those definitions from the ERP system. And it doesn't really matter if that's cost point and you're using account and org combinations, or some other solution and you're doing cost centers and accounts, or cost centers and cost categories, right? We can take those definitions and pull them in the interface. So there's a lot of background code that goes into doing those calculations. But on the front end, to an end user, they go in, they see their allocation definitions, they see their definitions for their cost pools. They see their definitions for their cost bases. And then they also have a bunch of other additional functionality that we've been able to build out into OneStream, specifically to do some more of the complex calculations that you might not see in some solutions.
Yeah. I think that was one of the more interesting things was we started with just the basics, so to speak, of the bases and the pools. Actually, the cost. It's always so, the lingo is a little bit twisted, right? Pool costs, pool bases. Pulling those definitions from the ERP, then using those definitions to actually get the numbers for a plan, to collect from the plan what those numbers are, to then figure out my pool rates, and then apply those rates for a burdening or allocation percentage. But then to your point, allowing for such that level of detailed data behind it for analytical purposes, especially the ability to look at that data in an actual versus budget perspective, right? So we talked a little bit about how, again, that's a bit of a circular process, how your AOP informs your FPR, which then kind of informs your AOP and back and forth as you fine tune. And so obviously giving you the ability to quickly iterate through that is one thing, but then once you're out of that cycle, also having that level of detail as you're marching forward to see how are we playing out against what we planned. And then I think we've even talked a little bit about maybe recalculating as you go, and as you're forecasting, am I going to hit my final goals for the year? And if not, what do I need to do about that?
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, and the solution specifically, right, it runs through the sequencing of the pools, calculates all the cost pools, calculates all the cost base, calculates the rates, does the actual debit and credits of the allocations, and then stores all that data in the cube for ready, easy analysis.
Yep.
And then like you were saying, yeah, it's great. You can have your FPR and you can run it on actuals and in your performance management solution and in the indirect rate cube, do some, in-depth analytics about what's driving variances in your pools and causing rates to be different than what you were expecting. But also you can then take forecast scenarios, and if you're revising what your forecast is for that year, run that through the allocation engine, stored in the indirect rate cube, and see where your rates are going. And if your rates are going to fluctuate enough, then you can submit for new rates to the government because you're seeing variances in your rates. Or take corrective action to try to figure out, okay, well, this overhead pool is high and this fringe is low, and what's driving it in terms of the cost pools and bases.
Yeah. Well, that's so I know OneStream loves the word financial signaling to talk about being able to see the signal coming that maybe something needs to adjust in your business. And I think that's a great example of how that can be applied to government contracting, specifically. And one of the things you said earlier that I wanted to say a couple things on was not only doing the basics, I should say, of the pools as far as cost and base, but also doing those more interesting or more difficult to do perhaps that allocations that not all ERPs can do around maybe direct allocations or multi-factor allocations. Again, that flexibility that OneStream has to manage all these different aspects of rates and interdependent allocations, because you might have some direct allocations that need to be performed, before your indirect rate allocations because of the waterfall dependent nature of them. And so we've heard from some of our clients they have to execute those in Excel currently, but with OneStream you can do your actuals in OneStream if you wanted, as well as all of your plan for those. So you don't have to bring any of that data out to Excel and then put it back into the system.
Yeah, you're not limited to cost bases that are expense-driven only, right? You can have cost bases that are multi-factor. You can pull in revenue factors, headcount factors, payroll factors, all these different factors that some organizations might use in their cost bases. You can leverage and do that in OneStream as long as the data is there for OneStream to know how to build up those bases before running the calculations and allocations.
Yeah. Well, and again, that comes back to collecting certain things in a way that makes sense. Some of those drivers might not typically be put in as part of a budgeting process, but since, again, we know that we're going to be executing those processes in OneStream, we can, blend that in, make sure that the correct people are putting in, square footage drivers, headcount drivers, or at least QCing those if the headcount drivers are coming from people planning, right? Because, again, we can use those interconnected systems to drive each other.
Yeah.
So, if you've got people planning, you don't have to sit down and worry about your headcount drivers. You know that they're coming from an already done and audited and completed process upstream.
Exactly.
So Colt, you mentioned cost point, and I understand that's pretty prevalent amongst government contractors. Can you talk about the synergies with cost point and OneStream?
Yeah, so CostPoint's a really powerful ERP tool for government contractors, and you can leverage a lot of the structures in CostPoint to automate the dimensions and hierarchies and cubes and structures that you have in OneStream. And so it interfaces really well with that product. CostPoint also offers a project budgeting solution and planning solution that allows you to do, detailed project budgeting and the burdens and the revenue. So you could certainly continue to use that tool, leverage that tool to bring the data into your performance management solution to really leverage the powers of the performance management solution. The tools just work really well together.
Yeah, absolutely. We've actually seen CostPoint not only in our government contractors, but in many of our other project-based clients. And I'll say that, again, I think that CostPoint has proved to be a very easy to integrate with and work with tool. As Colt said, some of our clients prefer to keep their project budgeting in CostPoint. Others want to leverage OneStream, and we can do it either way. And as it related to that indirect rate cube and analytical allocation engine that we built, that was actually originally built specifically for CostPoint to pull the definitions out of there. And we found it very easy to integrate with and pull the necessary data out of so that we could fully maximize the impact of OneStream as a performance management system.
Yeah, and essentially be able to replicate the complex calculations and allocations that CostPoint does, but doing it in OneStream, not just on actuals, but any of your plan scenarios.
Absolutely.
Great. You talked about financial signaling. Can you talk a little bit about how AI and machine learning is changing the future of that?
Yeah, for sure. At Archetype, we're really excited about AI and machine learning in general. We have a data science team specifically that loves to help our clients with all that. And we're very aware that forecast accuracy is a paramount concern for our clients, especially on the CPM side. That's one of the big things that clients spend a lot of money is trying to get better results out of their forecasts. They need to be able to accurately predict what's going to happen at the very least in the near term. And especially with Sensible ML coming out on the OneStream side, OneStream is really building into that space and allowing us to generate those more accurate forecasts and leverage AI and machine learning and algorithms that customers might not normally have access to get better results.
Yeah. In the short term, sensible machine learning and OneStream solution using time series is really powerful, especially when it comes to indirect costs, because there's typically a lot of seasonality in the way indirect costs hit. And so at any point in the year, if you could use sensible ML to say, hey, I'm 4 months into the year and my indirect costs or my pools have this much of a variance, and let it forecast out where the rates and pools are going, I think that really enables and empowers the end users to have a better understanding of their forecasts.
Yeah, for sure. And I also think that AI still makes up the foundation for how to solve the bigger problems that the world presents as far as instability in the economies such as COVID, as we all know about, things like that are really tough to predict without that level of machine involvement.
Yeah, the future of AI and just thinking about, hey, there's an administration change or the budget change this way, and how does that impact federal funding and then ultimately impact their budgets and their annual operating plan and forecasts.
Yeah.
So you've mentioned a couple of interesting things. You've talked about all these allocations and the complexity around there, and that it gets done in OneStream. Can you talk a little bit more technically about what you mean by that?
Well, again, it has to do with, like Colt said, we do. There's a lot of code behind it that was written that is super reusable. And that's one of the things that we're really excited about around taking those definitions and just scraping the appropriate sets of data out of OneStream. But we have the ability to technically also tailor that to any ERP, so we don't have to worry about, again, if you're using CostPoint or SAP or any other system that you might be using to track your expenses. We can, and pools, definitions, we can pull that out and put it into OneStream and use it to drive. So we really designed it as a flexible solution that doesn't worry too much about where the data is coming from outside of OneStream, and it defines it in a way that is more centered around the concept of these forward pricing rates or pool rates and less around a specific source of those.
Yeah, and similar to your accounting system, it runs through the calculations in a very similar methodology, right? It's just that we have also built-in functionality to do some more complex calculations that maybe your core accounting system can't do when it gets to multi-factor and stuff. And so really, it's just about taking those on the screen for the end user, your definitions for your pools, your definitions for your bases, the debits and credit accounts that goes with each of your pools, and then maybe some definitions for service center allocations, direct allocations, clicking calculate and just letting the code work its way through every single pool and doing the debits and credits so that upstream pools can flow to downstream pools.
Yeah. Well, and one thing that we did forget to mention too is you could obviously bring in those definitions from your accounting system, but then for like forward scenarios, budgets, forecasts, you have the ability to edit those, obviously. You're not just locked into what you have defined, but again, you get to use that as a base. So you'd obviously want to use those same exact rates as your accounting system if you're doing the actual allocation in OneStream, but then you want to be able to modify them for any forward ones. So it's very flexible that way. And this one more technical aspect that's worth throwing out is, again, we have the ability to use these multidimensional cubes for analysis of this data, but multidimensional math isn't the best kind of math for the particular allocation problem, right? So again, we have this ability to use relational tables and procedural code, which is really what we want for the allocations, but we still have this multidimensional database that houses the data, both sourced for budget and destination for budget and actual, so that we can compare them all and have that deep analytical capability that the cube provides. So that's one of the cooler technological features, I would say, of OneStream that allows us to create really the most optimum solution for this indirect rate problem.
And speaking of modifying your definitions after they pull over, like for some people, it might seem super painful to have to do all their budgeting at the very bottom account org combination level for everything. So they could certainly use input members higher up in their dimension hierarchies and budget at higher levels of their org structure or account structure, as long as they then go put those definitions in the pools that they want them captured in.
Yeah. It's very flexible. We wanted to make sure we had a solution that was able to meet any scenario that might come up in a way that was, well, any is probably a stretch. Many scenarios, all the things we could really think of. I guess we're not, seers of all potentials, but we really wanted to take our time to think through, logically what would make sense. What are the potentials of what we might see based on our vast experience on both sides of, from just a typical more commercial business, but also, Baker's Tilly's deep experience with the government space, government contracting space. What are those most likely potentials look like, and how do we develop a system that flexibly allows clients to kind of migrate between those if necessary?
Cool. Sounds like a ERP agnostic allocation engine was developed within OneStream.
Yeah, and again, I would emphasize with deep analytical capabilities. I think that's one of the things that is really where the big value comes from. I mean, the calculation it needs to be done before you can have that analytical value, but really, I think what we've seen with our clients is that the ability to get down to the account org level, and if you're in cost point and going, oh man, I was expecting X number of dollars to come through in this area and it didn't, or I think one of the things that we've talked about is the ability to have those different structures in the cube allows you to look at your business in different ways. And so if you want to look at a particular pool and say, what happened? Why is my rate way off, or why is my base higher than I was expecting? You can start to level it out to a particular org or a set of accounts or whatever it might be, because you have not just base level data, but the hierarchies that multidimensional cube comes with allows you to kind of quickly navigate through the data in a way that, again, is much more intuitive to users to find the problem or find the answer, depending on what you're looking for, quickly.
Yeah, no matter how you structure the hierarchies, you can go up and down depending on your reporting needs. And the easiest thing is starting at the top, seeing variances, and drilling down the hierarchies and figuring out what's driving them.
Yeah, and that's, I think, even from what we've seen in some of the best ERP solutions, they don't have, just because they're not built like CPM is, they don't have that multidimensional and multi-hierarchical way of navigating the data. So it takes a little more know-how and a little more time to analyze. And I think that's where a big return on investment is on a tool like this, is the ability to quickly get the answers that you need. Excellent.
Well, it sounds like you two could go on for a long time about all the details and intricacies in this space. What are just a couple of points you would want people to walk away from this conversation with?
Yeah, I think we've said these two words a lot: comprehensive solution, right? Mm-hmm. That is intuitive to the end user, right? Regardless of your different budget input methods, there are ways that OneStream can tackle that, from basic workflows and forms to using people planning to do percentages by employee, all the way down to detailed project budgeting on the direct side or even the indirect side. Being able to build up that AOP, and then also having an allocation engine and indirect rate cube to then run through all your pool calculations to build your forward pricing rates, to calculate it on actuals, to calculate it on any planning scenario, and do comparisons against those scenarios.
Yeah, I mean, I can echo that. I would say it's what I think OneStream solves the problem by having a comprehensive solution, right? A place where it all lives together and can quickly feedback as necessary, right? So that ability to iterate quickly with your data sets, to move the data where it needs to go so that you can change it as necessary, adapt, and end up where you need to be.
Excellent. Well, I hope you have found this as fun and as formative as I did. And I'm sure you may have more questions, so please feel free to reach out to Colt or John or both of them, and have a wonderful day.
Yes, thank you for coming.
Thank you for joining.